welcome back to Technically Challenged. This is a series on essential JavaScript. What is the kind of minimum JavaScript I need to learn to hit the ground running? This session we're going to be talking about variables and an introduction to scope. So let's dive in. Now if you see here, as I talked about last time, we have VS Code, I have a terminal, I'm going to run my file. I have a file named variables.js, and today we're going to be talking about let, const, briefly discuss var, and then an introduction to scope in the process. We'll go more into scope as we look into functions, but it's helpful to learn while we're learning variables. So here we have a variable, and like we talked about before with types, we can store any type of value really into this variable. Variables are really helpful because you can pass around values even if you don't know what the values are going to be at a time when you're making your code. You can send that variable and do stuff with that variable without even knowing it. So you can get a user's name, you can track the score, you can get input from the user, you can do all kinds of things with variables. So we're going to look at let first. So let is, if you think about the word variable, variable means change, like it can change, right? The temperature in the room is variable, right? Something like that. It shifts or changes, or the temperature in the house is variable. Depends on where you are in the house. So a variable can change, and that's kind of one of its features. So here, let is JavaScript's version of a variable that can change. So say we have a game, or something like that, and we want to keep track of the score. We use this keyword let here. We type the name of our variable. So what do we want the variable to be named? And then we use this assignment operator here to assign this value to that name. All right, so here we're going to save a number into score, or an integer, and then we're just going to log it with our console.log, which we'll learn more about functions later. But so if I do node in my terminal, node variables, it's going to run it, and as you can see, it logs the number 0. So I can move this around, I can pass score to other people so that they can use it, I can pass it to other functions, other things like that. One of the things that's a benefit about the let variable here is that I can now change it. So score later in the game, let's say the team gets 10 points, well I can update that later, and now it actually equals 10. And so if I log right after I set it, and then if I log after I change it, you'll see that it actually tracks with me. 0 and then 10. So that's one of the biggest features of let. If you know you're going to need to change a variable later, you'll probably want to use let. If you know it's something kind of fixed and static, then you won't want to use this. And so that kind of brings us to this other type of variable, which is called a const. And it gets its keyword or its nickname, const, or its short form here, for the word constant, which means it can't be changed. And so if you have something like, pi or your name or something that's not going to change, your name might change, so you might not want to use let. You might not want to use const for that. You might want to use let. But in this case, let's say we want it to be pi. Well, let's say we go up to 2 decimal places and we want to log it. It's 3.14. But let's say someone gets fancy and like, oh, I want to reassign pi to 3.15. Well, if you'll notice, this is actually going to give us an error. Type error, assignment to constant variable. So once you've set a const, you can't change it later. And so this gives you some protection in your code from bugs and things like that you might make a mistake in your code and not realize what type of variable that you've used. So this is the two main variables, let and const. Now I did want to briefly touch on the original type of variable, the only one that we did have in JavaScript before new versions of JavaScript came out, and that was var. So var is very similar. It's a variable. You can log it, all of that stuff, store things into it. But you could do some interesting things. For example, like var pi equals 6. Well, now it's logging 6 because that's the most recent value for pi. You can redefine and redeclare the same variable twice. If I were to try this with let, you see I get these red squiggly lines here. It's already telling me that there's going to be a problem. So if I run that code and I look for the error, identifier pi has already been declared. So using let alone will give us protection. It'll give us some more safety in our code and prevent errors, certain types of errors and certain types of bugs. So this is really helpful. Now I can always remove the let and reassign it. So in this case, if it was pi, I'd just probably want to use const. So that's one thing. There's another part of variables that I want to discuss, and that's this concept of scope. So let's say I have a score, in one part of my game, like we talked about before, but let's say there's some other part of my game, and these two curly braces here are going to create what's called like a block. Variables in JavaScript have a scope, or they have an area at which other code can see them and use them. And so in our case, we can actually do something like this. And then I want to log score again. And let's see what happens. Do we get an error? No, it actually works. Why does this work? Well, these two curly braces, which on your keyboard is above the brackets, shift, left bracket, shift, right bracket will get you these. These are used a lot in programming, especially C-style languages like JavaScript. Python, not so much. But you'll notice that I've actually created a scope. So this variable can only be seen in between these braces. So for example, if I change this to score 1 and this to score 2, and I tried to call it outside of here, let's see what happens. Score 2 is not defined. This scope between these braces, curly braces here, is limited to only between these two braces. And so because I'm trying to access score 2 outside of that scope, outside of this block of code here, it throws an error. And so this is just something to be aware of how variables work. They do have a scope or a visible area where other code can use them and see them. And I will also just mention that if you had score here and in the same kind of file you had score again, although you can do this, I think it's called like shadowing, it's not recommended because, whoops, I did a / 10 and 1, still works because this is scope. It can have its own name even though it's the same name. This could be very confusing because later in your code you might be like scope, and you might forget that you have a scope variable out here and a scope variable inside, and you might make some logic errors in your code based on that. This is a hopefully essential, quick run-through of variables and an introduction to scope in JavaScript. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. If you already know JavaScript and you have some essentials or anything that you think maybe I left out, throw those in the comments as well. Thanks for watching and have a great day.